Hello. Um, this is another edition of the Hastings Race and Poverty Law Journal interview session. Today we have Randolph McLaughlin. He's a professor at Pace University, and he wrote a wonderful article for the Hastings Race and Poverty Law Journal called The Birth of a Nation. And we'll get into the discussion about that in just a minute, but thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
And I guess we'll just start off. Tell us a little bit about yourself. Give us a little bit of biographical information. Where'd you go to college? What led you to get involved in the law?
I'm a native New Yorker, born and raised in the city. I went to college at Columbia University and then Harvard Law School. In terms of law, I was a product of the late 60s. When I was a young man, young college student, civil rights lawyers were changing the face of America, and I wanted to be one of those lawyers.
That's great. Well, based on your career, it seems like you've done that. Can you tell us a little bit about your early career and what led you into the university?
I started off working with William Kunstler, who was a famous civil rights, constitutional rights lawyer. He defended Abbie Hoffman and a number of activists in Chicago during the 1969 prosecution of activists for activities they engaged in Chicago during the Democratic Convention. Many, many movies and plays and documentaries have been written about that. So I was lucky enough to get a job working at the organization he founded. It was called the Center for Constitutional Rights. I started my career there. I worked with Bill for 8 years. We traveled all over the country handling murder cases, suing the Ku Klux Klan, doing voting rights cases in the South. We had a full range of things. So I worked with him for 8 years, and eventually I wanted to go into teaching because I'd left the firm for a couple of years and gone into private practice. I didn't find that too rewarding. So I went into teaching at Pace Law School. And in 1988, and the law school, the then dean said to me, what do you want to do here? I said, well, I came here to have the flexibility to engage in civil rights practice. And she said, well, we will encourage you to do that. We'll accommodate you. And I've been at the law school now for 30 years, and I'm probably the only professor in the law school, maybe in the country, who was ever given a sabbatical to basically engage in civil rights litigation, which is what I did, and I still do. That's
great. It's good to know that you're still out there fighting for civil rights.
It's not easy these days.
Yeah, it's a tough climate we're in.
It really is.
And so I guess that leads to the next question. What compelled you to write this particular article?
Well, I have a good friend who I've known since high school, and he received a PhD in history from Johns Hopkins. And we talked extensively back in the 90s, maybe. Yeah, 90s. About, actually, it was before that. We began having conversations about this work in the late 70s. And he was doing research into the first contact between West Africans and Europeans on the West African continent. And those Europeans were from Portugal at the time. So he did research in that area. So that led me to inquire myself whether or not there was any scholarship about the first contact between Africans and the English in North America, particularly in the Virginia Bay colony. So I began that research to kind of mirror his work on West Africa in North America.
Cool. And so what was the method to develop the scholarship? It's a pretty, I guess, interdisciplinary piece of work, doing legal history and also the analysis. And what sources did you wind up drawing from? And I guess a little bit about your method.
Well, the first thing is to figure out what the sources are. Was there anything that had been written about these first Africans? And I think the first book that I found, or volume, was William Waller Henning's book on the laws of Virginia from the beginning until 1800s. So I found those 4 volumes, and then I started to look at the very first. We knew Africans had come to to North America in 1619, and I started looking at the laws in 1619 to see whether there was any mention of Africans in 1619 or slaves, for instance. And what we found was there were none. There were no mentions in the early legislative documents of slavery. There was mention of Negroes, and they were termed as servants. So then I traced the development through the Henning book of statutes that had been adopted over the years from 1619 to 1705 to see how the law evolved. And initially, the statutes were quite clear that Africans had a degree of freedom, frankly, very similar to that of indentured servants. But then during the 17th century, the laws started to change to protect servants and debase Africans. So by 1705, the very first fully comprehensive slave code was adopted in Virginia that was replicated all across the South in later years, but the blueprint was set in Virginia. So that was the first thing I did. Then I tried to find cases that discussed the status of these Africans, and that was more difficult because it's not like in the 17th century there were reporters like West Reporter or traditional sources. So I found some authors, books, treatises, documents in various places that discussed a number of cases that had been litigated in Virginia by Africans. Africans going into court suing whites. In one instance, it was an African, his name was Anthony Johnson, and he was a former servant, had been freed from his period of servitude, and started to actually import Africans and English servants, and they worked for him. One particular servant, my recollection, his name was Casor, C-A-S-O-R. He claimed that he was an indentured servant and not a slave. Johnson, who was also black, said, no, that meant a slave. And 2 white individuals intervened and took Casor from Johnson. And Johnson was afraid to stop it because he was concerned I could be sued by this African. So later he thought better of it, and he actually sued the African. No, he sued the 2 whites in court in Virginia. Papers proving he was a servant, he was a slave. He was determined to be a slave. What's interesting is that at the end of the case, Johnson won a judgment against Parker. His name was Robert Parker, whereas Parker was now obligated to pay the cost of the litigation to Johnson. So it was fascinating to me that in this early period, in the 1620s, 30s, Africans could actually go to court and sue for their freedom. That wasn't happening in the 19th century. It just didn't happen.
And so it sounds like the history of race, particularly as it's related to slavery in the United States, it's actually quite complicated, whereas the way we think of it is often quite simple. And I learned quite a bit from your paper, and I guess what's the overarching point that you're getting to in the paper, and what's the takeaway?
I think what I found fascinating was the degree to which in the early periods, up until like 1676, up into that period, there was a great degree of integration. I hate to use that word because it wasn't, quote, integration, but the black and the white worker didn't see themselves as, diametrically opposed or in opposite camps. They were running away together. They were having sex together. They were marrying when they could. And in 1676, blacks and whites led a rebellion it was called Bacon's Rebellion, and they literally overthrew the English government and burned Jamestown to the ground. And of course, the British, as they were wont to do, they sent more troops and more ships, and they took back Virginia. They overthrew the servants. and some of the servants and some slaves now were still laying out in the outer area, in the villages and in the woods. And from that point forward, what you started to see was the introduction of laws that would protect the white servant and punish the African servant, to the point where the African servant was no longer a servant. He was just a slave. So what we believed was that race, which had not been used by the workers previously, was being introduced. Racism was being introduced by the planter class to divide these workers. And this is not the first. This was the first time in North America where racism was used to divide people who were frankly similarly situated. They did the same work. They worked in the same fields. It wasn't the slavery we see in the 19th century, where whites were not working alongside Africans. Whites were in charge of Africans. They were overseers. They were owners. But not in the 17th century. The planter class was a very small class. And we see that this same effort of blacks and whites to find common interest was replicated every century. It was replicated in the 19th century, in the Civil War and the Reconstruction era. It was replicated in the 20th century with the Civil Rights Movement. It was replicated in the 21st century, where we saw again blacks and whites electing the first African-American president in the history of the country. So there's always been this effort by workers or people who have a similar interest to kind of cross those lines. At the same time, there's been an effort by those in power to divide people into separate camps. And it's been pretty effective, the division. And now with the growth of social media and 24-hour news cycles and a president who tweets every 15 minutes, it's gotten easier and easier to divide people along race or other lines.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I think that's one of the points. A quote from the paper I was gonna bring up is you say, just elaborated on a little bit, the use of race to separate similarly situated worker did not end in the 17th century. And I guess from your time fighting for civil rights, particularly in the earlier part of the civil rights movement, or maybe in the later part as well, are there any specific examples that you can remember from that? And then how is that similar to some specific examples maybe from today that you can think of? Are these some things that you would want to speak on?
Yeah, well, that's a big topic. Let me start in several different ways. I think that the 60s, the civil rights movement in the 60s, I think was the most recent graphic, massive example of the coalition between blacks and whites to change the face of America and the laws of America and the practices of America. I think of the young white civil rights workers who went south and were murdered in Mississippi, along with an African American. His name was James Chaney, with Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney, and they were all murdered. So white young college students went south, and they partnered with black Southerners to destabilize the South, and they did that very effectively. In my own career, I'll never forget, because I'm a native New Yorker, and to be frank, as a native New Yorker growing up in the 60s, the only Southern accents I heard were either African Americans, and they didn't bother me. But when I heard a white Southern accent, I had this image of Bull Connors and just racists. So when I went south in 1982 in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we were suing the Ku Klux Klan because they had shot down 5 black women. They didn't kill them, but they shot them with birdshot. One woman had over 100 shotgun pellets in her legs, and she was in a lot of pain. So we're suing under the Ku Klux Klan Act of the 1870s to redress this violence by the Klan. So we're in a restaurant, and it was a very high-profile case in Chattanooga. And I'm in a restaurant, and this old white guy comes up to me, and he says to me, "Are you that lawyer suing the Klan?" And I said, "Yes, sir, I am." And I'm expecting him to give me grief. And he says, "Well, I want you to know one thing. we didn't like what those boys did, and we want you to get him for us. I'm like, okay. I was frankly shocked that this old guy was telling me we didn't like what those boys did. So I learned a lot when I traveled in the South that every Southerner wasn't a racist. That was the first thing. And there were a lot of good people in the South who worked hard to right the wrongs of apartheid. I call it apartheid. We call it segregation, but it's separation of the races. That's what it really is. So whatever term we want to use, it's the same effect. So those are the two graphic examples. But I think that in my work, we've always worked with different groups, different people, and we believe that the way to defeat racism, classism, whatever thing you want to defeat with, if it's based on hate, what's important is that people of goodwill along all those lines see their common interest and common humanity. If they can do that, we can overcome anything. It's difficult now. Right now is a very difficult period because of the election in 2016 has fanned the flames of racism and anti-immigrant sentiments and anti-Muslim sentiments, anti-gay sentiments. You just go down the list. So the question for us is, can we in 2020 overcome those flames and get us back on the path to freedom and justice?
Yeah, and that's a big challenge. And I guess one of the things that keeps popping up for me in this whole fight is I look at somebody like Bernie Sanders, for instance, who was involved in the civil rights movement. He started sit-ins at the University of Chicago the first time that those ever happened. He was a leader in those movements. He was arrested several times in the civil rights movement. And at the same time, I hear a lot of people that I have a lot of respect for, that I'm in school with, that are members of the Journal, who aren't so comfortable with him because he's an older white man and he doesn't identify in a lot of ways with certain groups of people. And I guess as someone with maybe a lot more perspective than the typical law student, maybe, I would just like to hear your opinion on that, just what you think about particularly Senator Sanders, but also the Democratic field and the shape of the Democratic Party today, and how it's maybe undermining what you just elucidated, that we need to reach across and see our common humanity, and that this is a struggle for workers' rights.
It truly is. I think that right now the Democratic field is probably the most diverse Democratic field in a presidential primary that we've ever had in the history of the country, ever. Yeah. Whether it's Ms. Harris, Senator Harris out of California, whether it's Senator Booker out of New Jersey, whether it's Elizabeth Warren out of Massachusetts, or other people who are from all sorts of spectrums. I think the challenge that Senator Sanders has is appealing to people from diverse backgrounds. I think he does a really good job with young people generally, but when he came out against reparations, that's a hot button issue. And I'm not saying that he should say, we'll write you a check tomorrow, all the folks who were enslaved all those centuries ago, but to kind of cavalierly just dismiss it out of hand, I'm not sure that's going to work for him in the primary, because in the primaries in many, many, many states, South Carolina being one of them, Mississippi being another, African-American voters in the Democratic primary process are very powerful voting force. And he's got to reach out to them to let folks know it's not just, oh, I'm here for election time. I'm here for you always. So I don't know how Senator Sanders will do in this crop. I mean, last go round was a different race, but now it's an interesting situation. I don't know how it'll turn out, but I think that the party is now very broad. You've got folks like Congresswoman AOC, who's to the left, and you've got folks like Doug Jones, who's hardly a leftist. He's more of a center, like Clinton used to be. So the question is, do we want does the Democratic Party want a purist, or do they want to win? And that's the question. And that depends on the voters. So it's an interesting time. I mean, I am, frankly, I have sued Democratic administrations. I'm suing them now. I've sued Republican administrations. So I'm not a party person as such. I mean, obviously we have a two-party system, but I look with skepticism at party structures. I look with less skepticism at the vote, at the will of the people. The question becomes, can the will of the people be expressed? And we have a system in the country, at least in the presidential side, that restricts the will of the people, and that's the Electoral College. So Senator Clinton won the popular vote by over 3 million votes, but she lost the Electoral College. So what's the will of the people? Obviously, they want her to be president, but because of the system we have, that will was frustrated, decided, and it's designed to do that. The system is designed, I think, to make sure that the will of the people is not necessarily expressed.
Right. Yeah, and I think that the system certainly, just the way it's set up, it's old. It hasn't been revised. And as we were talking a little bit before we started recording, and I told you I'm in Mississippi. My family all lives here, and I'm constantly just. It's disheartening to think about how electoral politics plays here, because almost 40% of the state is Black, and many, that's not a huge Latino population, but over 40% are minority voters in Mississippi. And still, every state house, the governor, 3 out of 4 representatives are from the Republican Party. Most of them are white. And that speaks a lot to me to how voters have been systematically disenfranchised, not just by the structure of the system, but by overt acts of legislation, by making it more difficult to vote, by requiring voter ID laws and things like that. And that's something I think that also needs to be overcome. But if you could speak a little bit to like where you think maybe some of the tactics lie to overcome that, and maybe to inspire people to get out and vote, and to.
Well, I think it's important for all of us to recognize that we have a voice in our government. Corporations don't have a vote. People have votes. And unless people exercise the right to vote, then they'll be disenfranchised. Now, you're right. And I'm not sure what the state, whether you have a voter ID law in Mississippi. I assume you do since you mentioned it. But I'm also a voting rights lawyer. I've sued in Mississippi. My first voting rights case was in Indianola, Mississippi, back in the 80s. We sued to change the structure of Indianola. And then I've had voting rights cases in the North since then. We're engaged in a voting rights case now in Long Island, out in Suffolk County. And yes, it's totally true that some in power want to restrict the ability of people who are not in power to exercise the right to vote. But as one judge told me years ago when I was in a voting rights case, he said, I voted in every time I get a chance. Every time I get a chance. So I've used that as a mantra. I vote every time I get a chance. But we have to get out of the notion that my vote's only one vote. It doesn't really matter. And then at the same time, you have to watch social media, because in the 2016 election, I'm sure it'll happen again in 2020, certain groups of voters were targeted allegedly by Russian bots or Russian trolls to discourage them from voting. So you've got the power structure on the one hand saying, we're going to make it more difficult for you to vote. Then you've got these trolls on the other hand saying, don't bother. So we have to be vigilant. Thomas Jefferson said it best, the old slave owner. He said, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance. So if we want freedom in this country and to maintain it and not to move towards a dictatorship, then we have to be vigilant. We have to guard against those who wish to divide us and suppress us and fight for freedom. Here's what I say about America. America, United States is an experiment in self-government. That's what it is. We didn't have kings. We don't have aristocracy. It was a fresh experiment. And the question is, how far can this experiment go? In the initial period, women couldn't vote. Men without property couldn't vote. Blacks couldn't vote. Asians were prohibited from even coming into the country. So during the earlier periods and before the 20th century, there were all these impediments to large groups of people. So I say the history of America is about the struggle for the expansion of democracy to include more than the privileged 1%, but to include the 99% who are not privileged. And that's the struggle. And I'm really happy to see that young people came out and voted for Bernie Sanders, a socialist. I mean, the idea that a socialist almost became the nominee of the party is like shocking to me. But that's because young folks turned out to vote for him. So I'm really hopeful that the future of America is bright, but we can't afford to not be vigilant because there are forces afoot, always have been, always will be, that will try and defeat the movement towards justice and freedom.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to put it. And you mentioned social media and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is from New York, and there are obviously downsides to social media and instant information where people can be manipulated, but also I've had discussions with people lately that these ideas that, for instance, that somebody like Bernie Sanders, a socialist, his ideas are even out there. Social media also allows people like AOC to have a huge voice and an instant voice when people attack her on different points and try to cherry pick her statements. She is right on top of it and is super savvy, I think, at using social media to sort of combat misinformation. And so on the one hand, there is the threat of people manipulating vulnerable and people that are generally susceptible to misinformation. I think the same as and it tracks, I think, with education levels and things like that. But also, there's an opportunity to really use this new technology to get these ideas out there to where they become undeniable.
I think that's completely correct. And AOC is a classic. I call her AOC. That's what she's called, like RBG and AOC. Yeah. They're just initials at this point. I think she is an amazing, amazing congresswoman and activist. She almost, I would say single-handedly, but she was very much in the forefront of stopping the giveaway of land in Queens, where I'm from, to Amazon. Whether we agree or disagree, I say whether people disagree or agree with the result, she was a powerful force to push back against that giveaway. When Michael Cohen was being questioned, she was the best of all the questioners. You would have thought she was a lawyer the way she was asking the questions she asked. She was excellent. So I have great support for her. I mean, just a love. I mean, literally, it's just great to see someone of her stature, as young as she is. She's got a bright future ahead of her, and I hope she stays true to the course. I have every expectation she will. So yes, social media can be used very effectively by those who want to destroy democracy and those who want to build it. Classic example of social media was what happened in Arab Spring, in Egypt especially. They used social media as an organizing tool. We've seen that in the United States. So it can be used very effectively. But like anything else, we have to be careful what we believe in when we see it on social media. I have friends, and sometimes I'll post things, and I'll see something that sounds a little outrageous to me, and I'll look and see, what's the source of that statement? And if it's a source that I don't know, have never seen, never heard of, then I'm a little skeptical of that. If it's a source that I trust, that's a different situation. So you have to always be, again, vigilant when you're in that arena to make sure you're not being used and you're using the media.
There's another sort of, I think, on-point situation that's very much at the forefront of social media right now, involving Congresswoman Ilhan Omar from Minnesota. And this is a very sensitive subject because a lot of people are extremely offended by some of the things that she said. At the same time, it seems to me that the issue of race is being used very much in the way that you talk about, to divide people, as opposed to sort of seeing that we have this common humanity, and that maybe criticism of Israel, for instance, is valid, but it seems to me that there's a huge group of people that are trying to co-opt her statements and take over the conversation and make it about something that's completely different. And in this way, I think people are being divided up amongst along racial and religious lines in this way. And I'm wondering if you have thoughts on that. And, obviously it's a touchy issue.
It is a sensitive issue for a number of reasons. I think that we all have to be aware and sensitive to the use of language. We have, in college campuses all across the country, universities, there's been a pushback against hate speech, on limiting speech of people we find offensive for whatever reason. There's always been that debate, whether we allow these folks to come to our campus and say things that offend us or not. And I think that when we're dealing with, when we're speaking about sensitive issues, we have to be sensitive and be aware whether we intend to hurt someone by our words can be powerful and used against us and against our goals. So we have to be aware, and you have to be aware that there are groups out there, forces out there, who will exploit what you say and try and make it into something that it's not. Here's the classic example. During the Cohen hearing, Congressman Meadows brings in a black woman as a prop. And the congresswoman, a female, I've forgotten her name right now, she says, someone who would do that, that's racist, in her opinion. And he gets all offended. Well, that just twisted the whole conversation. Now people are apologizing to Meadows because someone allegedly called him a racist, but what he did was use a black woman like a prop. I mean, it was absurd. So we have to be careful how we use language so it can't be turned against us. Look, every country should be criticized when they do things that are not consistent with international law or their domestic laws. So I don't have any problem criticizing any country for what they've done or are doing. But we have to be aware of the use of language and terminology, and we can't be cavalier and casual when thousands of people can read what you say. And to put it bluntly, the enemy will take what you say and use it against you. So you got to be careful what you say, especially now.
Well, I think that's a really great take, and I really like the way you put that at the end, that the words can be used against you by the people that you're trying to push back against in the first place. And yeah, just being thoughtful. It's hard sometimes because our emotions really get wrapped up in these debates, because these are really emotional and important issues, and it can be tough at times.
Yeah. Here's my motto. When I write an email, I don't write angry emails. I don't write angry letters. Before I hit the send button on the email, I take a beat. I read it over. Have I said something that could be used against me? Have I said something that could anger people who are on the other side of the equation? I make sure I'm not sending an angry email, because here's the problem with social media and this whole, tweeting thing. You don't feel the person's context. You don't feel their language. You don't see their expression. It's cold. It's a very cold medium. You and I are having a conversation. You can see how I'm moving. You can hear the tone of my voice. You can get a sense of what I mean. But when you're reading cold texts, you don't get any of that. So you have to always, before you post, think, then post.
Yeah. Well, I agree, and I got to say that I've learned a lot in the last few years about that, because I think that you know, I was sort of out there too much, and I've actually deleted all my social media in the last year just to get away from it, because it had become too much of a presence in my life, and I think I'll get back out there soon. So I guess we're at about 35 minutes. I'm wondering, do you have just some closing comments? Anything else you wanted to say about the paper, about the journal, or anything like that?
Well, about the journal, I think the journal has done an amazing job in keeping issues about race and poverty in the forefront of our conversations, both intellectually in the academy and out in the world. And I think that's an amazing thing that you all are doing. In terms of the paper, what I found most intriguing for me was to uncover evidence that what we saw in the 19th century wasn't preordained, that the history of the country is really a question of what individuals do and how we resist oppression. That's the history of the country. And King said it best, that the road towards freedom and justice is not always a straight path. So when we came in the 17th century and had a degree of freedom, frankly, and that was taken away from us, so the road turned back. And now, at this period of time and in various other periods of time, we've tried to push forward to advance the cause of democracy, justice, freedom, and civil rights. And inevitably, there's a backlash, there's a retrenchment, there's a redemption, they call it, in the 19th century. And we're seeing that right now. The election of Barack Obama, and I don't agree with everything Barack Obama did or said. I haven't agreed with anything that any elected officials done or said. But clearly, that was such a tremendous move towards racial coalitions and coalitions on all sorts of levels. And frankly, it scared the bejeebers out of a huge swath of our society that doesn't want that to happen. And they reacted. And the president we now have is a reaction to what happened before. So the only question I have is, what's next for America? Are we going to be prisoners of our own silos? Or can we look out across the barricades and see that that person we're arguing against is just as human as I am? They're not hateful. I mean, there are some people who are. I don't think there are any good Nazis, but someone thought there were on both sides. That's just crazy talk to me. But we have to do our best to try and see that there's more that unites us than divides us, unless we allow those who want to divide us to do that. And that's in our hands and in our heads. So the choice is yours. What do you do? Where do you stand? What are you going to do? Are you going to help to be the strongest link in the chain of freedom, or are you going to break that chain? That's the question for us.
Well, I'm inspired. I thank you for your words, and thank you for your time. And I encourage everybody to get online, go to the UC Hastings Journal repository, and check out Professor McLaughlin's article. It's our lead article in our latest edition, Volume 16, Edition 1. And I guess that's all for now, but thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Can you send me a link to this or some way that people I know can get access?
Yeah, I'll create a YouTube page, and I'll get the link to you within the next hour or so.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.